To everyone who organized the talk tonight. It's been a long time coming, and I thank you for being patient, and I'm really glad that it wasn't a snowy day. We did kind of miss the Valentine's Day window, didn't we? But we're all going to pretend tonight that we're on the cusp of Valentine's Day and talk about chocolate and think about where it came from. In my experience, chocolate is a kind of misunderstood commodity, and it is a commodity. It's one of the most important commodities traded around the world. If you look at commodities trading, chocolate is way up there in terms of its importance economically today. But the origins of chocolate, which is what I want to talk about mainly this evening, and its importance to New England in particular, is sort of shrouded in mystery, shrouded in sort of the period of time that we know a lot about in some ways. We know about this wonderful building, and we know about its place in the American Revolution, but we probably don't know much about the place of chocolate in that period of time. So what I would like to do tonight is share with you a little bit of my research, share with you a little bit of the work that I've done for Mars, and share with you a little bit of this fascinating story that is chocolate, about where it comes from and how it gets to our table and into the candy bars that we like to eat. And sometimes it's a story that is fascinating because it involves science and history and the age of sail and ships and the things that we like to think about a lot. But it also involves sort of this dark side that was alluded to with the production and where, who's actually doing the labor for the creation of this chocolate. So we're going to talk a little bit about all these things. I wanted to start just by, I don't see this as a shameless plug, but I think it's important for you to know that a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about is incorporated into this book called Chocolate, History, Culture, and Heritage. And this book came out in 2009. It's 1,000 pages. So, it's quite a substantial work that we're all very proud of. And about 50 different historians and researchers worked on this book. And we're thankful to Mars Corporation for supporting it, but it has become kind of a standard scholarly text that people are now referring to, having to do with all aspects of the history of chocolate in the Americas. So you might want to consider checking it out from your library or getting a copy. So this is the humble origins of chocolate. This is a cacao pod, and cacao is it's typically about the size of a toy football, not a full-size one, a little one. They're very little, but they grow on cacao trees, and they only grow in certain parts of the world. And I have my little pointer here. Inside the cacao pod are these seeds or beans, and they're kind of enveloped in a pulpy white substance, which is sweet and sticky. And once you open up the pod, that's what you find is this inside. What do cocoa trees look like and where do they grow? Well, cacao only grows in a very narrow band of land, only 20 to 22 degrees latitude from the equator. So there's a band of right around the center of the earth where cacao can grow. It likes hot climates, it likes really damp climates. It doesn't like direct sunlight, so it typically grows in tandem with shade trees, like banana trees. Now, there's a nice combination. But these are the countries that currently grow cacao. And when we're talking about Mexico, we're only talking about the very southern bits. You can get it in as far north as Cuba. But notice that it doesn't grow in the continental United States. Where does most cacao come from originally? Well, the plant has been traced genetically to the headwaters of the Amazon River, so up here. But by the time Europeans arrived in the Americas, cacao had migrated north into Central America. So this region here is where cacao was found at the time of Columbus. It's only later, through a result of European colonization and the spreading of the plant, because of its economic importance, that Europeans took the plant from Brazil and from Central America and took it to places like India and modern-day Sri Lanka and to the area here around the Straits of Malacca. Most of our chocolate today, though, that which we consume in the United States, comes from West Africa, and largely from this area right around here. And it's the Portuguese that actually first moved cacao across the Atlantic Ocean in the early 19th century and seeded in West Africa, where most of it comes from today. About 25 years ago, an enormous amount of our chocolate also came from Brazil, but there was a biological collapse of the cocoa crop because of a disease called witch's broom, which grew on the plants and harmed them. And so a lot of those plants had to be destroyed, and now the cocoa crop is making a slow comeback in Brazil. A lot know when the pods are ready to be picked. And this is what the pods look like, actually. This is a photo taken in Sao Tome. The pods grow on the trunk of the tree, and they also grow on the limbs of the tree. And you have to know they don't all ripen at the same time. And so you have to be constantly sort of checking on the trees to take the pods that are ripe, don't take them before they're ready, and be able to take the pods from the tree without harming the tree. It involves a lot of very careful machete work. And this can be dangerous not only to the tree, but of course to the workers who are doing the work. This is a photo of a cacao pod broken open, and you can see that there's a pulpy, sort of sticky substance around these. You can put them in your mouth and suck on them. They're very nice to have in your mouth. They don't taste like chocolate, though. They just have a little hint of chocolate flavor from the pulp. But this tells us something about how the crop spreads. Things like monkeys that can actually open the pods and then ingest them. This is one of the ways that the trees move around, and the fertilization of new cacao fields is sometimes done by nature, by the animals that open them up, and can open them up, and then ingest the seeds. Again, so here's a tiny little map. This is Brazil again. This area of Brazil, just below the place where it sticks out furthest to the east, is a place called Ilhéus and South Bahia. And these are the regions where cacao was really intensively formed and intensively farmed in the middle of the 18th century. So the cacao that is coming into the Americas, it doesn't grow here naturally. It has to be shipped up, and it's shipped through the colonial channels of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, and various other colonial powers that are in Central and South America that are supplying chocolate to the major ports along the Atlantic seaboard, coming into Philadelphia, into Boston, into Newport, into New York. These are where this is where the cacao is coming from and where it's going. A lot of the cacao coming into New England was referred to as Caracas cacao, because it was channeled through the ports near Caracas in Venezuela. And so being put on ships and then come right up the Gulf Stream to various ports along the North Atlantic coast. Another little map of Bahia, which we can safely go by. One other picture of a cacao pod, and you can see how it's pretty easy to break it open. It has the consistency of like a thin pumpkin or a squash, but once you get into it, it's those beans or seeds that we have to focus on, because that's where the good stuff comes from. That's what has to be processed to make the chocolate. So they have to be stripped out, and this is all done by hand, even today. Cacao as a product, as a crop, most of it today and in the 18th century was produced by small farms, small landholders, families that might have had half a dozen or a couple of dozen trees. There weren't very large-scale plantations until the 19th century. But in the colonial era, you have this dispersed crop that had to be consolidated and shipped up, but most of the work is being done by hand. And you see it stripped out, and then what has to happen to those beans is they have to be fermented, and then they have to be dried. So we pile them on the banana leaves that had been stripped off the shade trees that were protecting the cacao trees, and you pile them up on those banana leaves, and you let them sit for a while, you cover them, and you let them ferment for between 6 to 9 days on average, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, depending on the environmental or weather conditions at the time, but the beans have to kind of molder and get hot. They build up a heat, and that allows them to ferment. Once they've been fermented and they're ready, then those same cocoa beans need to be dried, need to be completely desiccated before they can be shipped. And there are a number of ways this can be done. They can either be sun-dried, but because cacao tends to grow in areas that get a lot of rainfall, it's difficult to sun-dry them. You have to wait for dry periods of the year to harvest and dry them outside, and you have to cover them very quickly if it starts to rain. Or you can do them over a fire, but the problem with that is you have to arrange a heat that's very dry where the smoke won't penetrate into the chocolate. Because if it does, then you get a smoky taste, and that ruins the taste of the chocolate. So usually it's best to sun-dry them if you can. This is in Brazil. These are drying racks. The beans have to be constantly turned over so that they dry evenly. And this is, as you can imagine, a massive operation where you have lots of trees with lots of beans, and they have to be very carefully dried so that they can be shipped without rotting. Then they're bagged, getting ready for shipment. Each of these bags weighs about 50 kilos, which is 110 pounds more or less, and they're shipped using Atlantic world wind and current patterns right up the coast of North America to the ports that we're familiar with here in 13 colonies. Another map that shows some of the Portuguese trade routes through the Caribbean and then up into Boston, New York, and Virginia. These are where the chocolate is going. I want to take us across the Atlantic, though, for a few minutes. In the early 19th century, right when the Portuguese knew that they were about to lose Brazil as a colony, Brazil gets its independence in 1821 and 1822, the Portuguese moved cacao consciously, because they were aware of what an important crop it was. They took it across the ocean to their tiny little island of São Tomé, St. Thomas. And it's off the coast of Gabon. It's right on the equator. It's 45 miles long and 18 miles wide. And right around the period of World War I, this tiny island is the #1 chocolate producing area in the world. 40,000 tons of cocoa a year were coming off of this little island, 18 by 45 miles. Pretty extraordinary. And the way they did it was they intensively farmed the cacao using forced labor right into the early 20th century. So that's São Tomé, and the Mars people were kind enough, because they wanted to know about this, and they, to their credit, they weren't going to shy away from some of the labor practices that were going on there. They wanted to know about it, so they sent me there to do some research about how this was done. The reason I want to share these pictures with you is because perfectly preserved in São Tomé to the present day are some of the structures very much like the way cocoa was being produced intensively even in the 18th century in some of the big plantations in Brazil and Venezuela and other parts of Latin America. So I could take photos of things that didn't look very much different from the way they looked in the late 18th and early 19th century. So that's what we're going to look at. This is a plantation house in São Tomé. Another one, present day. And that's how it looked at the very end of the 19th, early 20th century. But what did the work look like? These are the workers gathering in the morning, getting ready to go out onto the plantations to take care of the trees, to water the trees, to create new areas for planting, to harvest, to do all of the work necessary for intensive cocoa farming. This is still going on in West Africa, in some parts of West Africa, but on a smaller scale. Those are workers' homes at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and that's what they look like today, and people are still living in them very much the same way. People harvesting cocoa using a hole with a clipper or a trimmer on it, and getting the pods from the trees. People, mostly women and children, who are stripping the piles of pods, and then these become, by the way, fodder for pigs and other animals, and they become fertilizer too, the cocoa, the husks of the cocoa pods. There they are. Little light railways that were built in the 19th century to move the cocoa from the fields into the processing areas where they would be fermented and then dried and then bagged, just like they were 150 years ago. Drying areas, drying racks that could be, these were on rollers and they could roll inside if the rain happened and be covered up to keep them from getting wet. This is a unique and really interesting piece of equipment. This is a tile floor covered in cocoa beans, but underneath of it is an oven. And the heat of the oven would heat the tiles and then have a really dry heat to desiccate to dry the cocoa beans, but the smoke would not penetrate through the tiles. So the taste of the cocoa remains clean. By the way, some of the very best artisan cocoa in the world is being produced in Sao Tome today, and it's available in Boston and New York. The guy who produces it is an Italian guy called Claudio Corallo, and he has this cocoa from Sao Tome, which has a unique flavor. There's the oven being tended. These are women working in these massive yards that are full of cocoa beans. They're drying them and turning them over with their feet and using baskets. And those are still there in Sao Tome. Some of them have been turned into soccer fields. And this is a hospital to take care of the workers who got sick. Sao Tome cocoa bagged up. Again, why did I make this great diversion to Africa when we're talking about colonial America? Because that's where our cocoa comes from. It comes from Latin America. It comes from Africa. And I wanted to share this with you so that you have a sense of the kind of intense labor that goes into creating the confection that we all enjoy. The kind of labor, field labor, and the real handwork. Cocoa is not produced very differently today as it was. It's produced very much in the same way that it was 150, 250 years ago. Very similar. Bags of cocoa waiting for shipment. Again, they're about 110 pounds a bag. And now they're being shipped out by Portuguese, by French, by Dutch, by Spanish merchants, graded and put into milk or water, sometimes mixed with wine, Madeira wine from the Portuguese Madeira Island, to make a beverage that was rich and thick and strong and had qualities that attributed to chocolate, medicinal properties, properties of sustenance. They gave it to sick people as a medicine because the idea was that chocolate was so powerful that it could, sort of raise your energy and raise your health by drinking this beverage. It was typically a breakfast beverage, and our colonial ancestors got a surprising amount of it in the period leading up to the American Revolution. During the 18th century, chocolate goes from being a relatively rare, relatively expensive drink enjoyed mainly by elites to something that was actually accessible by most middle-class people in the American colonies. And one of the ways that we know that is that there were so many people selling and marketing and milling chocolate, even right in this area. Indeed, right in this neighborhood, there were a number of chocolate mills operating in Boston in the 18th century. Now remember, chocolate doesn't come from here. It comes from places pretty far away from here. But it's being shipped up and then processed by the people who are using it. So they receive the chocolate after it's been fermented and dried in those big bags. It comes into the colonies like that. The next step to make it something that's consumable is to roast it, very much like you would roast coffee beans. So you have to roast the beans, then you take the husks off, and that's hand work too. This is a guy that I photographed in Brazil. I get lots of comments about this picture, but in any case, he's taking the husks off the beans. He's on a plantation near Salvador de Bahia, Brazil. They've just roasted a big batch, and him and his friend here are taking the beans and making them clean to take the husks of the beans off. And then the beans have to be crushed And this is the way that chocolate has been made since the time of the Aztecs, since the time of the Incas. They have a warm stone called metate, and a roller, or a grinding stone. This image, by the way, is from Didier's encyclopedia, the French encyclopedia of the mid-1600s. So he's grinding chocolate here on a heated stone in order to make it into a paste, a brown, slightly bitter paste that is the pure chocolate grinding from having ground the beans. Okay? And you're going to see that later on. There's going to be a demonstration of how that works. Now you've got this slightly bitter chocolate paste, and like a super dark chocolate that has high cacao content that you've tasted. What are we going to add to it to make it more palatable? Well, in the 18th century, sugar was widely available because we had sugar being produced in the Caribbean and in Brazil, so you could add in some nice brown or yellow sugar or even pure white sugar if it had been bleached. But the 18th century palate also liked to mix in spices. Things that were pretty exotic, coming from Asia. Things like nutmeg, or clove, cinnamon. These are things that frequently are mixed into chocolate. Now, bear in mind, the Aztecs didn't have sugar as a sweetener. What did they mix in? Well, they mixed in things that the Europeans didn't have prior to Columbus. Chocolate is an American plant. Cocoa is an American plant. It comes from the Americas. It's not known prior to Columbus. But what the Europeans brought to the picture was sugar, which they brought from the Old World. And they found cocoa here, which they could mix with another American product, which is vanilla. Vanilla is also a New World plant. The Europeans brought in some of the spices that they were getting from Asia, and then that made a beverage that really had some zip to it and was a great breakfast beverage. There's another reason why spices sometimes found its way into chocolate, though. And that's because some of the same machinery that's used for grinding spices was also used for grinding chocolate. And sometimes you couldn't get all of the pepper or all of the mustard out of your grinding stone. And so sometimes that found its way into the chocolate block that would be sold in the shops as well. So chocolate had a different taste, and it wasn't standardized at all in the way that we would think of today. Yes, there were recipes, there were lots of different things that you mixed in with chocolate. Sometimes there are actually recipes that called for the addition of ambergris, which is a product that comes from Wales, from the whaling business. It's used as a fixative in the perfume industry, ambergris or ambergris. But some really high-end recipes for chocolate called for the addition of just a touch of ambergris because it was so valuable and so valued. But it must have given the chocolate a very odd flavor. Things like pepper and mustard also found its way into chocolate. And one other thing to think about with chocolate of the 18th century and the chocolate that you're going to have an opportunity to try here is that the grinding technology was not able to get the smoothness, that buttery smooth feel that we have with chocolate today. It's a rougher commodity. It's got a grittiness to it. And that was unavoidable and indeed kind of pleasant once you get used to it. It's a chunkier chocolate, if you will. It's a nice thing. It's different from the 18th century. So here's the metate that's got chocolate paste on it and some of the spices that might be mixed in. Aniseed is another. There's some nutmeg, clove, cinnamon sticks, bits of other. Sugar is here. Here's vanilla, and you'll see that all of these things are going to be mixed into the chocolate that you'll have an opportunity to taste soon. This is what a chocolate preparation shop or workshop might have looked like in Europe in the 17th century, the 1600s. Again, from the Encyclopedia of Diderot. You have a press here to press out the excess cocoa butter. You've got the metate here. You've got someone mixing probably sugar and spices into it. You've got drying trays, and you've got a heating crucible here. Now, Chocolate in the American colonies, most of it is made in a very simple way like this at home by the people who are going to consume it. But if it's going to be produced commercially, there are a number of things we need to think about. One is, if you're going to do it commercially, you need someone or a team of people who can do a lot of it to make up chocolate for sale in the shops. One of the biggest chocolate producers in the 18th century was a Portuguese immigrant to Newport, Rhode Island, who had a number of enslaved persons working on chocolate that were making dozens of pounds a day. His name is Aaron Lopez. He's a very famous local guy connected to the very famous synagogue, which is in Newport, Rhode Island, the oldest synagogue in the United States. Why was he in Newport, Rhode Island? Well, he had gone to Brazil, fleeing the Inquisition in Portugal, and then ends up in Newport, Rhode Island, and founds this community of Jews in Newport. But they were also, he was known as a merchant, and he's one of the biggest of chocolate. Getting in the 1750s, 1760s, we're going to start to mechanize this process. And we're going to build mills that can make chocolate more quickly, more efficiently, and therefore more cheaply. So a couple of ideas about mills. This is I know that you're so far away, I wish these were larger images, but we're going to move from the metate to a water-powered, rolling, heated stone heater to do this process in a powered way. And then by the 19th century, we're going to have a much bigger operation, factories for producing chocolate. This, of course, is a mill. People understand how a mill works. The water comes down from the pond, turns a wheel, which turns the machine. One of the main mills that I've been looking at is not too far from here. There were mills right in this neighborhood. Some of them were mills driven by not tidal waves, but the tidal action of water coming in and out of the harbor. But others were, there was a mill pond that was connected to the north end, and the mill pond had a sluiceway that was used for milling just 100 yards from here. Milling grain, milling spices, and milling things like chocolate. Very nearby. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So, in the 18th century, milling equipment included things to pound the husks off the seeds, a heated stone with a roller that went round and round and round, and other machinery to do the kinds of tasks that had been done by hand. These are too difficult to see here. This is a close-up of that milling machine that I told you about. This is a German one, so it's got the Schokolade-Maschine, but it was heated from the bottom, the stone would be heated, and then this would go round and round and round and round, and squeeze the chocolate paste into something which would roll down the stone and be collected on a tabletop down here. See the top of the table is there. Okay. So, here's Boston as it looked in the 18th century. Boston Neck. Here's the mill pond. We're about right here. And I wanted to read to you from the historical record various chocolate makers that were right here in this neighborhood. At the east end of the causeway on the mill pond, near the junction of Prince and Snow Hill Streets, was a grist mill, sometimes known as the North Mills. This is between 1730 and the 1790s. It was owned and occupied by Samuel Welsh, miller. On the causeway adjoining, with a shed in between, was the chocolate mill of Jonas Welsh, his brother, where he made chocolate in 3 package options, priced at 1 shilling 2pence, 1 shilling, and 10 pence. So we had 3 packages for each, for everybody's wallet, everybody's pocketbook. 3 other millers that had North End milling establishments for chocolate were John Brewster, who comes into the public record in 1732, 1738, 1742, and 1766. He had a shop in the North End. Another miller, Samuel Dowse, had a mill located in Charlestown, just across the water, and he's in the public record in 1762. And Israel Eaton, who in 1752 and 1760 had a house and a shop near Mill Bridge, which, if I'm not mistaken, Mill Bridge connected Charlestown. No, sorry, this is the Mill Bridge is here. So it's really close by. It's not far from where we are at all. And we have numerous chocolate producers making chocolate for the Boston market. People were buying it, people were consuming it. The mill that I've been looking at a lot is in Rhode Island. It's a Rhode Island mill. A little town just north of Providence called Central Falls, which has been in the news a lot lately. What a lot of people don't know is that Central Falls, before it was incorporated, was known colloquially as Chocolate Mills or Chocolateville, and it's because it was one of the oldest chocolate mills in that region. Started in the early 1780s, probably 1781, and lasted, was actively milling chocolate until 1806 when the mill was destroyed by a flood. This is on the Blackstone River that runs right through Rhode Island. Now, if you think about those dates for a second, 1780s, 1781, the fighting at Yorktown is still going on, the siege of Yorktown. And in this part of the world, we're just coming out of the very end of our bid for independence. Then, through the 1780s and beginning in 1789, Europe explodes in warfare with first the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars. So the mill that's functioning in Rhode Island, as well as some of the ones functioning in this neighborhood, are producing chocolate during wartime. Why is that significant? Well, chocolate is a commodity used by soldiers and sailors as a means to buck up their energy while they're on the march or when they're on heavy duty at sea. And so, as a commodity for military provisions, I apologize for the quality of this, but here's William Wheat, who has a mill in Providence, one of the paper mills, and he's making up chocolate, wholesale, retail, variety of other articles, and he's doing this all during the time just prior to the end of the American Revolution and then into the Napoleonic era. As a provision, the ready market is to sell this chocolate as foodstuffs and military provisions or shipboard provisions. And we see lots of records of that actually happening. This is a mock-up of the mill as we think it may have looked in Central Falls, the William Wheat Mill. We have based that on historical research, and I don't know if you know the Blackstone River Valley very well, but this is the bend in the river in Central Falls, and the ruins of the chocolate mill were right by the bridge on Roosevelt Avenue, which used to be known as Mill Street. And there's a little park there, if you ever get over that way. There's a park here that commemorates the mill that Mars helped us to do. These are land records from the early 18th century that show the chocolate mill right there. This map is from about 1826. It shows the ruins of the mill. That's where the mill was. This is where the bridge is. There's a dam there, a mill dam. Now, back to military provisions. Why would troops want chocolate? Well, chocolate gives big bang for the buck in terms of energy. It's portable, it's compact, you can carry a 1 or 2 pound lump of it in your haversack or your backpack. You can use it with your friends. You'll have one pot and 6 guys will make up a pot of cocoa and share it in the morning, and you can march on it for half the day if you have a good solid breakfast of chocolate and maybe some hardtack biscuit and maybe some other stuff, maybe some dried raisins or peanuts or things like that. Chocolate was a very good military provision. So a lot of armies, both in Europe and the United States, consumed chocolate when they could get it. And we have a lot of records of American colonial troops buying chocolate from provisioners who followed the armies on the march and carrying it in their works. You can go down to the Massachusetts Historical Society in Back Bay and look up some of these records and see what the soldiers were eating. Chocolate plays a role in that. So they might have carried it in their backpack or that's a cartridge belt, but in a haversack, they might have carried chocolate. The other guy that we know carried chocolate was none other than George Washington. This is his personal field mess kit, and prominently featured here is a chocolate pot that he carried with him and used pretty much daily. He would have had his page or his aide de camp who would have helped him to make chocolate in the morning. And it has a hole in the top to put a blending stick, which I'll show you a picture of, to whip up the chocolate and make it nice and frothy and mix it with whatever else you mix it with. The other place chocolate is used is on board ship. So we have a fair amount of records of ship's provisioners supplying pretty hefty chunks of chocolate, amounts of chocolate for crews going to sea in merchantmen, warships, and in whaling ships. Chocolate's particularly important. I happen to live in New Bedford. I live about 100 yards from the, 200 yards from the docks in New Bedford, and we're all very excited because the New Bedford whale ship Morgan has been recently completely refurbished at Mystic Seaport. She's coming home this summer for the first time. But on the whaling ships, because they were Quaker ships, they were dry ships. They didn't serve alcohol on board, except for purposes of medicine. So instead of alcohol, instead of your daily tot of rum or your grog, you would get a dose of chocolate after hard duty, after a storm, or if the captain just wanted to be nice, he would give the whalers chocolate. So here's New Bedford, waterfront, whaling ships. The peak of whaling in Nantucket and New Bedford is the first decades of the 19th century into the period of the Civil War. And during this period, we just have wonderful records of provisioners putting chocolate on whale ships. And some of the other fish out of the North Shore of Boston, out of Gloucester and Cape Ann, these guys are in their dories. When they got back after having rowed out into the North Atlantic to catch cod and other fish, sometimes they would be given chocolate as part of their provisions in the galley. Ship is rolling back and forth, and they're trying to save whatever was on the stove. But chances are, in some cases, chocolate would have been a part of their daily diet. Another great image of a galley on board a fishing schooner or a whaler. And these are outfitting for a whaling voyage. These are lists of provisions, and chocolate is always included in the provisions. I know you can't see this, but chocolate is right there. 2 boxes, 50 pounds a box for a whaling voyage. And chocolate is also medicinal, and so it was sometimes used on ship as an additional substance. I'm going to finish with a couple of images taken from Europe. How is chocolate consumed by the wealthy masses? Well, here's a couple of things. This is the ancient house of the chocolatier in Lisbon, Portugal. It's a 19th century building on a square right in the middle of Lisbon, and this was the king's chocolate service, made out of silver, commissioned from the silversmiths of Louis XIV in the early 18th century, early 1700s. Beautiful stuff. A bit better than what an average person might use. This is the blending stick I was telling you about that goes down through this hole in the top of the pot, and you would do this and whip up the chocolate and whatever else you could put in it, spices or maybe Madeira wine, something else, to make a really nice beverage and whip it up and make it frothy, and it's heated from the bottom. It would be set on something like this that has a little burner here to heat the pot, and the chocolate pot would have sat on that as well. That's a brass chocolate pot with the blending stick going through the aperture of the top, and this was something that would have been much more accessible for a more common middle-class household, something made of copper, something made of brass, but it does the same job. It's just not as finely made as the silver. And I quite like this. This is a Spanish tile panel from the 18th century, and it's got a joke involved here, as you can see. He's serving fine porcelain cups of chocolate, and there's some little biscuits here, and these are 2 servants, both in uniform. They're in servant's livery. They have matching outfits. But the young man is quite taken by the young woman, and so he's spilling some of the chocolate. And this would have been a typical tile panel that you might find in the kitchen of an aristocratic home in Spain or in Portugal, where lots of chocolate was consumed in the 18th and 17th centuries. In fact, in Spain, there's a whole debate, a theological debate, about whether you could drink chocolate at certain times of the day or certain days of the week. Was drinking chocolate breaking your fast? on fast days. Huge theological arguments over this. You could drink beverages, but was chocolate a food or was it a beverage? And this mattered for Catholics who didn't want to break their feast day. This is the King of Portugal, who's depicted receiving chocolate from a courtier. This is a little miniature, 1720, João V is his name. But you can see that chocolate was really important, even at the highest levels in the royal courts of Europe. It was an esteemed drink, an esteemed beverage that everyone loved to drink. They mixed it with things to make it even richer, spices from Asia, and it's something that's really enjoyed at all levels. Final couple things to say quickly about medicine. We mentioned earlier that chocolate was medicinal. This is a text from 1580, Jesuit missionaries in Brazil who are recording how chocolate is used by native peoples. And they're writing this down, and the very first chapter here is about the virtues of cacao, or cocoa. And according to them, the prepared chocolate had the power to open the body's passages, it's good for asthma, comfort the mind, the stomach, the liver, aid asthmatics, and those with cataracts, among other salubrious qualities. So even in the 16th century, people knew how really great chocolate was, and they used it as medicine. And that was true right up to the 19th and even early 20th century. On Hershey's packaging, in the early 20th century, they would have on these pound bars that were meant for cooking. And it said, right on the package, more nutritious than meat. That's what it said. I love that. This is great. This is from Brazil, 19th century, actually 1914. This is a product that is prepared with guarana, which is a stimulant, phosphoric acid, cola, coca, like cocaine coca, and cacao. And if you had this, all of these stimulants, you are prepared to have force and vigor, força y vigor, and of course you can wrestle bears, because that's how good this stuff was. This is how it was sold. It was a product that was made for health and to give you energy and stimulation, even into the early 20th century. Recommended by all of the celebrated physicians, medicals in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you very, very much.
The clubhouse, which is around the corner where Captain Jackson's our shop is right around the corner, and it's part of the old North Church campus. It makes it all very nice and clean. So what we do here today is take you through the history of chocolate from your cacao pod to the 18th century chocolate beverage that you would have enjoyed either in your home or your local coffee or tea shop. And chocolate was primarily enjoyed as a beverage right up into the 1870s when the Swiss started adding milk to chocolate, and there you successfully had your first no chocolate candy bar. So this is your cacao pod, and two things that I find very interesting about your cacao pod is first, chocolate starts as a fruit. It grows on trees, there's seeds inside of it, but unlike your apples and your peaches and pears that grow on the end of the tree branches, the cacao pod grows out of the trunk of the tree. So you get these small clusters of flowers all over the trunk of the tree and the main branches, and the pods grow out of that. It takes about 6 months for these pods to fully grow, mature, and ripen. They were handpicked by the Olmecas, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and they're still handpicked today. So human beings have been enjoying chocolate for over 3,500 years. So we take our cacao pod, and you break it open. And unlike your other fruits, we're not interested in the fleshy part, we're only interested in the seeds. These seeds are surrounded by this white pulpy mixture. The pulp and the beans are just dumped on the ground in these great big huge mounds. They're allowed to ferment and germinate in the sun. They're spread out in great big huge drying racks, packed up in burlap bags and shipped all over the world. So here we are in colonial Boston. Shall we curtsy? Welcome. We would get our beans, and they would be roasted at our hearth fireplace. And from there, you would put them into what we called your winnowing basket. This basket is actually quite small. These baskets were huge, and you would do this step outside by taking and tossing the beans. You're separating the beans from the shell, and the shells are breaking down into your little cocoa nibs. So we do have some of the shells here, and they're quite light. They would have just blown away in the wind. They would have been used and are still used for mulch and fertilizer. And actually, it was said that Martha Washington enjoyed a chocolate tea that she made out of the shells. But we're more interested in your cocoa nibs. So we're going to take our cocoa nibs and we're going to grind them down into a nice fine powder. And actually, this is my favorite part of the entire presentation, because while the nibs are still incredibly bitter to taste, that fresh chocolate aroma is just absolutely heavenly. So we're going to take our cocoa nibs and we're going to add them to our metate. Now the metate would have had a full bed of coals under it. We tend to use a hot plate down at the Captain Jackson's to evenly distribute the heat underneath the metate. It's actually just opening a stone. So you take your Amano menu, grind down your nibs. And the heat from this metate and the grinding melts them down to a nice cocoa butter. And it would be at this time that our spices would be added. You're good. First we have your vanilla. And then we have your cinnamon. And we have your grated orange zest. We have your red chili pepper for that Mesoamerican influence. We have your nutmeg, as well as a little anise or anise for our licorice flavor. A little salt. Salt's a magic mineral that makes everything taste better. And then, of course, we have your annatto. Now, the annatto doesn't add anything really to the flavor of your chocolate. It just gives it that nice reddish brown hue. Makes it a little more appetizing. So you would take whatever spices you as your chocolate. Maybe would care to add to your chocolate. And we don't know what Captain Jackson's recipe for chocolate would have been, but we do know that these were all the spices that were being added at that time. So we would continue this process for, say, an hour. And at the end of that hour, we would have 1 pound of chocolate. Lucky for us, Captain Newick Jackson, our chocolate maker here in the North End, had his chocolate mill just down the road of what was Clark's Wharf. Had the great big huge grinding stones, so he's mass producing the chocolate at a much, much greater rate. So we would continue this process till we had a nice buildup of our chocolate paste or our chocolate liqueur, work it off the end of the metate into our chocolate mold, set that mold aside, allow it to harden. Once it hardened, it would be broken down into smaller portions, or what we fondly called in the 18th century as your chocolate cake. Not exactly the chocolate birthday cake you'd want to take a bite into, but in the 18th century, this is how you would be purchasing your chocolate from your local merchant. So here I am, thankful Flo of the Ebenezer Club House. I would, of course, purchase my chocolate from Captain Newick Jackson. I would get my chocolate cake home, and I would grate it down into a nice fine powder, because we were drinking our chocolate, not eating our chocolate. And it would be at this time that your sugar would be added. Your white refined sugar was an expensive commodity. They would have used it very sparingly. Plus, they didn't have quite the sweet tooth that we have today. So we'll take our chocolate powder and our sugar in some hot water, and we'll add it to our pot here. Now, of course, we had our coffee pot, and we had our teapot. So this must be correct, it's your chocolate pot. Your chocolate pot had this special handle on the side. It also had this little frothing stick or stirring rod that came up through the cover. You would take your 3 main ingredients and stir, infusing the chocolate into the water, creating a very rich and thick 18th century chocolate beverage, which we will be serving you on your way out the door this evening. And what we have here today is not what we make here in our metate, but it's you. What we'll be serving you is the American Heritage chocolate drink. It was made for us by the Mars Chocolate Company. It does include all 8 of your spices here, plus just a little bit of sugar. So if you like that rich, bittersweet chocolate taste, I hope you'll enjoy this as well. And I hope you enjoy your presentation this evening.